Hello? Okay. Hi, thank you so much for coming tonight. Very excited to introduce Dr. Dustin Polis, who's a doctoral level board certified behavior analyst with a doctorate in school psych from Lehigh University. He has almost 20 years of experience working across both approved private schools, residential treatment facilities, and public schools. Dr. Polis's work and research focuses on the delivery of educational and behavioral services based on applied behavior analysis from students with significant intellectual disabilities to students with significant mental health issues. Dr. Polis is an adjunct professor at Arcadia University and teaches courses within the BCBA course sequence. He has been the chair of the Bucks County Autism Association's annual autism conference for the past 8 years. Currently, he serves as a supervisor for advanced clinical services through the CCIU, where he is responsible for developing innovative, evidence-based programs to address the needs of students within their schools. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Dustin Polis.
I'd like to thank you guys for this opportunity to come here and talk to you guys about a really important subject, I think, that is starting to certainly become more important as we're looking at being able to provide adequate supervision and training to people. So tonight, as we go through this, it's still we're a small group, still relatively informal, so feel free, raise your hand, throw something at me, if you want to discuss a certain topic, or there's something you want me to talk about a little bit more, no problem there. We will take a break about halfway through, because I know that'll be good, it's a long time. You should have a copy of the PowerPoint. There'll be a couple other slides that I added in there, because even last night I just started trying to think of better ways to tie in some of my ideas and my themes, so there'll be a couple new ones up there. There's another sheet. That sheet right there, if you could just turn that one over, because I don't want you looking onto that just yet, and that's going to be a little activity that we'll do later on. I've actually built in several different activities that are going to build upon one another, so I really want this to be just an interactive session, allowing us to discuss this topic as we go through it. So the first thing that I'm going to start by covering is an overview of clinical supervision, what it is, what are some of the different models out there, the model that we're going to talk about tonight, how you train new skills, how you're going to have different tools for direct observation when someone is out implementing ABA techniques, how you evaluate someone's documentation evidence, and then being able to sit down and provide people that lovely feedback. This training is geared, I tried to incorporate multiple areas. So whether or not you're an administrator who might be supervising a behavior analyst, whether you're a behavior analyst who might be supervising someone doing their internship or supervising behavior managers that could be in a classroom, or whether you're working closely with teachers as well, I tried to incorporate multiple ways that this can apply to what you might be doing. For myself and my level of supervision, I work across a variety of BCBAs and BSLs within the CCIU that are under my direct supervision. So I have a variety of them that, when I just started, this is a new position because I spent the last 9 years up at the Central Bucks School District. So I've just started in August at the CCIU, and it's nice because I've come to a nice place with a lot of BCBAs, and one of my goals is to really start to take a lot of the stuff that I've started to put in place doing my own internship that I would take people through and try to apply it at a much larger stage. So let's start talking about the right staff, right? And what are those qualities of the right staff? How do you determine what you want to teach people, how you're going to teach people? But before you do any of that, let's start with a discussion on what are some of the most important qualities for a staff person to exhibit. This is a question to you. So what are some of the most important qualities when you think about someone who's going to be providing services?
Willingness to learn.
Willingness to learn, excellent.
Ability to follow directions.
Ability to follow directions is going to come in very handy. What else do we think about good qualities of staff?
Like receiving feedback.
Receiving feedback,
Yes,
right?
being able to receive that feedback.
And address it. Absolutely.
Dependable.
Dependable, excellent. Takes initiative, someone who's going to be a go-getter.
I would say attitude, so a positive attitude versus a negative one.
Right, isn't that one of the particularly And is this a little hard right now? It should be a little hard for a lot of the BCBAs in here because I've just asked you a very different, and you're going to see how this is going to work into some things later. But I'm glad that a lot of you were able to come up with this and start to talk about some of these, because attitude's a tough one, right? Because as a behavior analyst, what is attitude, right? So, and all we know is, but we know what it is. We also know it's probably the most difficult thing to change, right? All the other things become different skill sets, but we will talk about attitude. Yeah. Love for the population, some empathy for what families go through, empathy for obviously what children are experiences and in relationship to this disability. Great. Those are all, I think, wonderful qualities that we're looking for when we're trying to hire staff and bring them into positions to work with individuals with special needs. Let's also set the groundwork and talk a little bit about supervision, because we're going to get into some of these pieces. These are going to be some of the themes that we're going to be looking at. Who here really looks forward when your supervisor has to come in to observe you? Right? Isn't that the best day, when you're knowing that someone is going to be coming in, watching what you're doing, evaluating you, maybe writing something up, they've got the paper, they've got the pencil, and then you know that inevitable meeting is going to occur? That's great. We're so excited about that. Who also really looks forward on the other side of getting to sit down with a staff person that you've supervised and have to deliver critical feedback? So how comfortable do you think it is for the person on the other side? So we're going to talk about feelings, and about how those can impact us. And it's important to remember that there is a human element. Now, we are going to operationally define what those human elements are, but I want to start this conversation more broad and indicate that we are talking about working with people. And these are people who are working with children and adults with disabilities, who have problems communicating, have significant problem behavior. And so we're going to talk about, well, why do you feel that way? Why do you think people don't look so forward to being supervised? Why do you think you might feel uncomfortable having to sit down with someone and give them that constructive feedback? Well, as behavior analysts, you should be able to do that, because when you think about your primary job, right, our job is about the why. That's what we try to do every day. We try to figure out why something is happening. And so as we go through and we talk about a lot of the different pieces today, I'm going to be relating a lot of that to your work as a behavior analyst. You're going to be a behavior analyst on being a supervisor. How do you analyze that behavior? How do you analyze the behavior of a staff person? And we're going to use the same type of terminology, same type of ideas that you would apply during your everyday practice, where you're trying to figure out the why of that problem behavior, determining those hypothesis statements. So why is it occurring? What sets the occasion for these feelings? And then why do they occur? So we're going to talk about clinical supervision, which is different than more traditional supervision, or the absence of supervision, which kind of goes on a lot. And there's a difference between supervision and evaluation. Right? Evaluations can happen as part of supervision, but there's a lot of places out there that really don't do supervision. They do evaluations. And that could be annual, sometimes it's semi-annual, sometimes it's quarterly. But we're going to talk today that if you do evaluation in the absence of supervision, it's not really going to be horribly effective. So we're really going to talk about a clinical supervision model. This is about talking about the skill set of an individual person that you're working with, and being able to work and develop that person, not just evaluate them against a set of criteria. So with clinical supervision, we attempt to be interactive. We want to engage the individual, as opposed to a directive type of supervision where you're just providing all the information as to what they need to do. It's a democratic type of supervision. You're looking for input and feedback from the other person, right? Don't we know that when you want to work with a teacher in a classroom and you want to recommend certain interventions, that if you simply say it needs to be this way, it might not be as effective. You might not have high levels of treatment integrity unless you incorporate some of their ideas and some of their thoughts. Sometimes we even decide to go and follow their track first because we know it's really not going to hurt the situation, but we know our track might be a little bit more effective and get us there more quickly. But you know what? If it helps me develop some better rapport with that teacher to kind of go his or her route first, that goes a long way in building that rapport and that relationship to work more effectively with that person. We want to think the same thing as when you're providing that supervision. We focus on improving skills. I mentioned that just a second ago, and we're going to talk a lot about the different types of skills, how you teach those skills, how you evaluate those skills. And while focus on meeting expectations is important, because we're going to talk about what are considered like core skills and individual skills, just like you would think about with students. We know that there are sets of core skills, right? If we know in verbal behavior, if we're going to utilize a VB map, we know that we have a set of 187 core skills, that covers 3 different levels. But we also know that within that, there's that backlist that contains another 5 skills for each one of those 187 skills, that those skills are further broken down. And those have become more of your individualized types of skills. So we're going to talk about the same type of process, because it's important that it's individualized, whereas other supervision is, well, here's what we expect everyone to do, and this is what you're going to be evaluated against. So we're going to talk about a different type of supervision where you have your core skills, but then you should also have your individual skills that you're working on with that person. Observation and follow-up, very critical with clinical supervision. You can't just hope and pray that they're going to make a change in their behavior. You have to observe it, you have to take data on it, you have to determine whether or not your approach to teaching that skill and raising that new behavior in that individual is working. This is the process that we'll be going over. We're going to be talking about developing core skills. We're going to be talking about meeting with staff to identify specific skills, how you select training curricula in a delivery format, providing that staff training, conducting that direct observation, and then providing that feedback. Okay. Let me raise this up. All right, so this is one of our first activities, and this activity is going to build into the next one and build into the next one and build into the next one. So in a small group right there, which will be sets of 2 or 3, discuss the critical skills for a professional to possess within your service delivery model. And I went on your guys' website and I took a few job titles, so those should look somewhat familiar. Tried to do a little research to find out a little bit more about Melmark, what they do, how they're set up. So think about these job titles, pick one of them, and then talk about and outline some of the specific skills that you would find very important for someone to possess. All right, so go ahead and do that for a few minutes. Okay, take another minute and then we'll share some of our skills that you guys came up with.
Is it easier for you to hear if we ask?
I think I might be able to hear
You
them.
just want to repeat it so that everyone else can hear?
Yeah, or we could mic, I guess, either or.
Hold on.
Okay.
You up really close, almost right in front of the.
In front of the PowerPoint slide. Oh,
Yeah, go to the right. You would. That would be great.
this way?
Thanks. And give a fake presentation like John. That's it.
Like I'm talking. I'm giving you guys, I'm making a pose, I'm talking to you, I need some feedback back to be sure that people are listening so this looks natural. It does not look natural at all. These photos, I'm rescinding my permission. There's no more permission for the use of these photos. Okay. So I got Jennifer the mic back there. So who would like to share a skill or two off the list? Raise your hand and we'll get over a mic to you and be sure everyone can hear you. All right.
Okay, we talked about clinical associates and teachers. So for clinical associates, we said need to be flexible, willing to learn, and be positive. And for teachers, again, being flexible, willing to take feedback, and also willing to learn, and multitasking is very helpful as well.
Okay. Excellent. Thank you. Another group.
So we're going to do the ABA counselor. We also did the CC. Where's Dory at? For the ABAC, we said continuous competency and understanding and implementation of information that you receive throughout the job, and that they may change. So that's why we always say continuous competency. So not just sticking with one thing. And then the clinical coordinator, we just said organization and flexibility.
Okay. One more group. Who else want to share something? Okay.
So we had being able to follow a BSP, so being trained on a BSP and really being able to follow that and implement it each and every day. And then we also had communication. So if you're seeing issues throughout the day as an ABA counselor, really communicating those issues with the behavior analyst or supervisor, so then we can make changes if need be.
Okay. Great. So, you know, it was interesting because I set the stage. It was kind of a setting event by changing my slide and starting with that first slide and giving you a little bit of talk of the types of skills. Although I wasn't saying skills at that point. At that first question, I said qualities. So we're looking at qualities of people. Here, we're trying to look at some of the critical skills. But it's good because I already kind of set your mindset to start to think about things just a little differently than perhaps is part of what your current evaluation system kind of looks like. So as a behavior analyst, we are very used to breaking behavior down into critical core parts, taking data, whether we're talking about a task analysis of a larger skill or whether we're talking about the scope and sequence of teaching certain skills and the progression of verbal behavior. This is what we're used to, and we're used to collecting that type of data. Well, the same is necessary when you're talking about evaluating staff, because we do have to, again, rely on what we know, which is observable, measurable events of behavior that can be used. But I think it's important when we start to think about what do we really value in a staff and how are we then going to evaluate them, you have to start with what those core values are. And you're going to get hit with some of those less than typically observable terms like team player, accountable, patient, positive, dedicated, problem solver. And so what you guys want to do, or I recommend that you do as an organization, is you kind of start there about those core elements and then to think about, all right, but how do you measure that? Like, okay, we want people to be a team player, but what does that look like? I mean, right? Think about all the times when you're sitting there and you're perhaps doing a behavioral interview with a teacher and they're saying, well, he gets really anxious or he gets this way or that way. And right, our usually follow-up is, okay, but what does that look like though? Help me figure that out, because I've got to turn this into some form of data that I'm going to collect. So I need to know what him getting really upset actually looks like. We have to look at this topography and figure this out. It's the same thing here. You have to start to think about what are some of the more specific observable skills that you can look at. When you think about your own evaluation systems, and I haven't seen the exact ones that you guys use, but I know I've seen and been a part of a lot of different ones in the past where they really are a lot of very discrete skills. And it's usually about their ability to utilize proper error correction procedures, looking at their reinforcement ratios, looking at their ability to accurately collect data, fading and shaping procedures. These are things that we then evaluate and check them off on as they go through. But think about what we talked about at the beginning. What were the skills that you guys valued the most? Do we measure those? Do you have measures for those? Or do we focus so much on what their job is supposed to look like and kind of remove some of that human element? So one of the things that I'm hoping to kind of show as we go through today is there are ways to look at some of those other pieces that you guys talked about earlier, some of those other human elements, and start to break them down. And you're going to be practicing as you go through the rest of the evening, taking some of those pieces and being able to break those down and think about, well, how would you measure that? What would that look like? And what type of data would I collect on that? One of the things that's important with clinical supervision, and one of the things that has been found in research to be important with supervision, is called a pre-meeting, which sometimes doesn't always happen. Hopefully some of you have been part of that, and hopefully this is something that you will do yourself. But it's important to be able to meet with someone prior to going in and providing that observation where that supervision is going to be provided. So that pre-meeting kind of helps them. It's effective to have a staff do a self-assessment, see where they are. You meet with them. You talk about individual goals. It's important to have, obviously, those core things that are important that, when you think about Melmark, that you know that everyone needs to be able to exhibit. But if you were to say, here's our Melmark curriculum and here's what all of our kids will do, that's not going to fly too far in an IEP when you're talking about an individualized education program. So I want to take the same approach when you're talking about working with staff, taking an individualized approach. You could have your core skills, just like you have core areas that you work on with students and adults. At the same time, you know that there are those different ones. That's the more individualized goal or tweak that you're doing for that particular student or adult. Same thing here. You want to think about what other skills that you need to work on that are more specific. You also can give feedback about what this initial observation is going to look like. We talked earlier about how nervous people can get about the observation process. Well, what they've found is that when you do these pre-meetings and you kind of talk about what the purpose and function of this observation is, when you're going to be coming in, and you're talking about their self-assessment, you're taking an interest and ownership into their own professional development, then you coming in the room is not as nerve-wracking. And how many people function really well and at their best when they're really nervous? Right? You want to get accurate data. How valid is your data going to be if the person is really, really anxious? So we obviously want to try to bring some of that down. These pre-meetings can certainly help with that. Sorry, that black looks a little dark, but now we're going to kind of jump to talking about developing curriculum. There's a lot that could be done to talk about in this area, so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time. There's a lot of different research out there. We'll talk about a little bit as we go through some of the pieces of adult learning theory, but that's like a whole separate piece. But we're going to approach it pretty similarly to the way that you might think about writing a behavior skill program, skill acquisition program, not sure what you guys might call them here, treatment program for a particular skill. So here we're going to talk about different ways to set this up. It's going to start with identification of the target skill, rationale for why that skill is being trained, a description of what that target skill looks like, how it's going to be introduced, what opportunities will the supervisee have to practice the skill, how will the supervisor deliver performance feedback, how will skill mastery be assessed. Well, I'm in the process of trying to use this format that you'll see, and you'll see some different examples up here that I'm using now, and I've got other ones where I'm trying to build kind of my own curriculum database of a curriculum for teaching people to deliver applied behavior analysis. So some skills require, role play techniques. Okay, well, I'm going to outline what that role play looks like. Some of it is going to be things that will be better suited from maybe some video. Maybe it's going to be someone just being able to do direct observation. Some of the stuff that we're going to talk about isn't always about them engaging in a particular behavior that you're kind of observing. There's also writing, right? So how do you look at, when I'm evaluating my BCBAs, I have some criteria which I evaluate their FBAs and positive behavior support plans that they write. We have evaluation processes for looking at IEPs that teachers develop, data collection systems that are being taken and maintained. So there's also the document part that we're going to talk about as well. So it's important to know that this curriculum, covers everything. And you're going to write it in a similar way that you would write another skill protocol. So let's take a look. So implementing a token reinforcement system. Right? This is one of the more kind of discrete skills that you would have a staff person wanting them to be competent in. Why? Because this is a fairly core skill. A token reinforcement system is a part of the majority of clients that you guys are going to work with in one form or the other. And again, token reinforcement does not mean it's just a penny board. It's just any type of visual representation that is linking those behaviors to reinforcement later, and then by providing that check mark, by providing that sticker, by providing that piece of money, that is then providing reinforcement for a behavior that's going to happen later. So we start with rationale, why this target skill is being trained. This helps the person who's going to be teaching it to also, this is like your introduction. Think about your introduction if you're a teacher and you're working with kids. In order for someone to really want to learn something, they need to know why it's going to be important to them. You explain that to kids, that's your hook. Then they start listening. You've made it relevant to something that's important to them. Adults the same way. We're going to find that hook. How do we make it relevant? You want to explain kind of the rationale, why this is important. Then we have to be able to describe the skill. What is it going to look like? How can we define this in observable terms? How will they demonstrate that skill? What resources can we provide to them to help them demonstrate that skill? So right now I'm trying to also gather up different articles that would go along with, and chapters that would go along with some of the skills that I want to be able to teach. A lot of this right now that I'm currently working on is being developed as part of an internship model that I'm trying to design at the CCIU, where we're going to be able to provide opportunities for people, because we have lots of different types of programs where people can essentially do their internship. But as part of that program, they're going to be going through, their supervision isn't just about sitting down and just kind of talking about things. Their supervision is going to be about the development of skills. All of my interns, we do kind of a pre-meeting. They do a self-assessment, and then we select 2 goals for each quarter that they're completing their internship that they're working on. And we set up specific objectives for that, and it's usually related to some of these pieces that I'm doing here. So right now, this curriculum starts to write itself whenever they pick something, and then if I don't have something for it, then now it's like, okay, now I got something to write. So then I'm writing it. How am I going to support my intern with the development of this skill? They've identified it as something important. I think it's something important. BCBA task list says it's something important, so apparently, I'm going to work on it. What opportunities will they have to be able to practice that skill? With a lot of things, we're going to start by being able to have them demonstrate it. Then there's going to be maybe some guided practice where perhaps I'm modeling it first for them, then they're sitting and doing it and getting feedback from me, moving to independence. How will I deliver performance feedback? How will that person know when what they're doing is right? Right? Sound familiar? So we need to talk about where will that feedback happen, what will it look like, and then mastery. How do you know once someone actually has it and is ready to be independent with the implementing a token reinforcement system with a student? Now, I'm not going to talk through the next one. This is just another example because you guys are going to be working on your own. But this is just another example of a skill. This one's different. This is something more that perhaps a teacher or even a BCBA would be doing, which is how do you teach someone to develop a task analysis? What does that training look like? So again, this isn't necessarily working directly with a client, but this is about the actual production of what that task analysis is going to look like. So everything from why that's important, description of the skill, how they're going to demonstrate that skill, opportunities for the supervisee to have to practice that skill, select 2 different students, 2 different skills, develop task analyses. Supervisor is going to review them prior to use and deliver feedback. Supervisee is going to collect data, review with the supervisor, and then whenever they receive 90% on some type of applicable section of observation feedback form. So then there's, most of the time when you go in to do an evaluation on people, it's not just token reinforcement, you're evaluating some different things. And so I'm trying to create a larger form that would go along with it. So now, back into your groups, taking a look at the skill that you identified. You just have to pick one of them because I know you all kind of picked a few. Just pick one of the skills that you identified earlier and discuss what you would put into each section on that behavior skills training protocol. So what would that look like for you? Oops. Getting some good work done? Okay.
Direct observation. The behavior.
We also could use a concrete method, like a scorecard or whatever. Yeah. Yeah. But they didn't really go through their
Taking IOA.
We actually, we had a question, because we were looking at a skill that we took, the ability to receive feedback, and I didn't know, we were talking about like how broad this concept is and how, you know, you can, but we didn't know if we were straying away from like operationally defining it. Like with some of the stuff.
She did, like, let the supervisor say, okay, as for further clarification, if necessary, make a plan to incorporate feedback in the job performance. And then we were kind of getting a little broad. We were talking about make a plan with supervisor for supervisor to observe, you know, supervising,
that way.
you know. Are we on the right track?
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about, you know, obviously a lot of those observable events that you're trying to look at. I mean, not that you'd have to be so specific. I think in some of it, you know, in terms of looking at a supervisor, but thinking about what's the actual outcome that you want. So if they're going to be able to receive feedback.
We said don't argue.
We can't. You can't really
Right.
operationally define not arguing.
You know, but I think you can talk about what you say there, which is, you know, asking for further clarification, if necessary, accepts the feedback. So by saying accepting the feedback, it means you're saying doesn't argue with me.
Oh, okay.
So
Okay.
if they accept the feedback, ask for clarification if necessary,
Okay. Could be more like.
identifies either, because sometimes I try to guide them to identify a way to improve their behavior, or it's a matter of,
When I actually said make a plan, I meant for the supervisee to make a plan, kind of.
oh, that's
if you're
good, yeah,
saying-
so supervising
Yeah.
may make a plan to be able to change the behavior. And then you want at the end of that conversation, come to agreement on the plan. So it means there's actually indicating, yes, they agree to it. And then the last piece is going to be, you know, monitoring the actual follow through of the behavior. Because right now you're working off of just, right? I mean, the ability to, and you might want to say, change it from ability to receive and respond. It's more or less, you're looking for the ability to respond to feedback.
Yeah.
The reception of it is obviously important because you want people to be receptive and open. But you're really also, the ultimate goal of this is, did they respond to it?
Right.
Because there are times where some people maybe aren't that great in receiving the feedback, but you know what? They go and they make the change. Because feedback makes them uncomfortable, but do they end up doing better in making that change?
Like getting defensive at the beginning, but they do, but they take it in and they still make changes.
Yeah, sometimes I have to give feedback and I can just tell they are uncomfortable. They're not happy with what I'm saying. They don't exactly agree with what I'm saying. But they understand that I'm their supervisor, and they go back and you know what, they do their job and they do it well. So you don't want to get too held up on, you know, they look at me, were they nice to me, and things like that. I mean, obviously those are still parts I think you can, but ultimately I want to know, are they changing their behavior or not?
You have a switch.
Oh, did I switch it off?
No.
Or no? Oh, unless. Take another minute and then we'll talk about what you came up with. Came up with something good, right?
We have worked with one of our rehab colleagues. We talked about using a gait belt with some of our individuals.
Okay.
So we went really specific.
So I don't know if you want to mic people now. So I'll have them. Okay. Now let's talk a little bit about what you kind of came up with this exercise, what you kind of thought about this exercise, but we'll first kind of share some of the things that you guys came up with. So who has a group that would like to share the skill that they discussed? All right, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. There's Mike. So the skill we talked about was teaching staff to accurately take data. And make sure I go in order here. The rationale, all of our decisions are based on our data. So it's really important that it's accurate. That's going to influence decisions in regard to medications, restrictive procedures, different interventions. So really making sure that piece is very tight and very accurate. The description of that skill, teaching staff to collect all different types of data. And we're going to do that by using role plays, looking at videos, and then scoring data appropriately, and getting practice with that before moving into the natural environment. So they'll kind of have to test out as they go through. So role play with a supervisor, meet a certain criteria and test out, then kind of shadow a staff in the natural environment, test out appropriately, and then actually practice collecting data in the natural environment with an actual student. And then feedback would be given through each step. So during the role plays, during the video scoring, direct observation of them on the floor, and using IOA is a good method, just to make sure no opportunities are missed and that the data is being collected and collected accurately. And then different checklists would be developed to make sure that they're kind of hitting those benchmarks as they move through.
Excellent. Awesome. Another group. Give an idea.
We chose accurate completion of behavior incident reports.
Mm-hmm.
So the rationale was that documentation of behavioral incidents helps the clinical and administrative teams develop better programming for the individuals we serve and accurately address safety needs. Description was that the supervisee will learn how to complete the behavior incident report. This would include providing information on when the incident occurred, what was happening prior, a description of the incident, the need for restrictive procedures if applicable, and comments should also be made about the safety of the individuals involved if any follow-up was needed. The demonstration, supervisees would watch a video of an incident, and the supervisee, this is the supervisor, I think we skipped the part. Yeah, the supervisor completes it and models the skill for the supervisee and explains what they're doing with each field. And then the supervisee would also do the same thing with new set of videos. And competency would be established by having meeting a certain criterion on a checklist in 3 consecutive videos. So 95% or higher accuracy.
That's great. So that was a different example of taking a look at the paperwork. So moving away from thinking about an individual skill and moving into that paperwork that everyone loves to do. And I think you did a good job of setting that rationale kind of in the beginning, because I don't know if direct care staff always just understand how important that type of documentation is and how critical it is. And I think you did a nice job of setting the stage there as to why this documentation is important. It's just not another piece of paper we need you to fill out. We use this information. It's vital to us further developing what we need to do to protect your safety and the safety of others. You say it in that way and you talk to people in that way and you explain it in that way, and it's kind of like, oh, okay, I should do that then. Yeah. Should have been doing it before, but but sometimes it is what it is, and you have to kind of be able to go that route to connect with people to get them to understand the importance of something. Another group.
Okay, so we did the competency of being able to implement a behavior support plan. So we're talking about mainly like ABACs, counselors, if you were supervising them. We did the rationale as basic, where we want to decrease the behaviors of concern, and we want to create opportunities to increase behaviors for acceleration. We want to make sure that it's universal and consistent throughout all staff. The description of the skill is obviously understanding the behavioral definitions, so what the behaviors look like, what the functions of behaviors are, and these are just some of the things I could go on, but providing the consequences as well after behavior has been shown from the individual, so the consequence that the staff would provide. How will the skill be demonstrated to supervisees? So during the on-site training, the person who's being trained would be modeled by a senior trainer with that client in particular that they're learning the behavior support plan of, and this is kind of what we do more so in the department that I work in. So from experience, I know that this helps. And then as well as then creating a scenario that kind of flips that. So the trainee now is in rotation and implementing the behavior support plan, and then the trainer will stand behind and making sure kind of that IOA, that inter-observer agreement as they're taking data, implementing the behavior support plan. Some of the opportunities that the supervisor will have to practice the skills. So of course, role plays are a wonderful idea during weekly team meetings, during daily team meetings, anything that the new employee may need. Training in the safety care techniques that program may be running in case that individual does have a crisis behavior plan that may go a little bit further, that needs some safety care techniques involved. And how will the supervisor deliver performance feedback? We had agreed that biweekly check-ins with the individual, mainly during those biweekly check-ins, take time to understand how that person's doing, so their feelings, talking about how they feel when they're here working and how that impacts them here, how that impacts them in their personal life, as well as any information they would like to share, not going into too much detail. And then as well as going through specific strengths and weaknesses that they feel as though they self-assess, and then as well as the evaluations that we have assessed with them. So kind of comparing our strengths and weaknesses together, and then going back to that rationale so that they understand why we may do some of the implementation and why their strengths and weaknesses may fall in that line. And then the last one, skill mastery, will be assessed through the treatment integrity checks that we provide through a checklist that in the department, as well as the inter-observer agreement.
Excellent. You did that all in 10 minutes. Wow, look at that. It's amazing. Nice work. So I think, and so you're looking at something that is certainly, a larger type of skill, which is, the successful implementation of a particular treatment plan. You'll find that as well, like you can have like that component, because I think there is the skill set of understanding how important it is to follow a plan and implement it and do that. There's kind of that larger understanding that is really important for staff to get. And then there is, while you're doing that though, you'll see that there's individual steps and other skills and components that you very well could design more individualized programs following that same format to be able to break those down. So I know this is something that's a little different because most people don't think about, when they're thinking about staff development and teaching skills, about developing kind of your own curriculum. So this was something new that I've started to try to think about. And a lot of this did start to come out whenever, all of us had to start getting our supervisory certs to then be able to supervise interns. Maybe come get my 8 hours. And so I took a course, and it started making me think a little bit more about, I could do a better job at building the skill set within the behavior analysts that I'm working with. And so how do I do that? And I've been trying to work with that along with kind of my knowledge with adult learning theory, and that I've been taking from being an adjunct professor as well, of trying to work with, okay, same idea. Now I'm working with these people while they're taking their coursework. How do I get them to develop the skills that they're going to need to then be able to be successful in their internship? And then in their internship, how do I develop the skills to make them successful to be behavior analysts and to be able to pass the test, right?
When you come out to talks like this, you should put the steps of the behavior skills training protocol on a sheet and have everybody do it and then collect them. And
That's right. I could start building my own collection that way. Have you guys do that? So, but it's certainly a process that, and I don't know how you guys are necessarily set up here, but it's a way to start. I know some of the things that I'm going to talk about tonight are things that you guys do and you guys do very well. And I'm sure there'll be a few things here that could be a little different in different takes. And I think probably the idea of designing and thinking about from instructional design. This is about instructional design. Just as we sit down and we have to think about instructional design of teaching a skill with a kid, this is instructional design relation to a skill that you have to teach a staff person. And so often we have those trainings, and I'm sure you guys do, as we do as well at the IU. We've got a set training, right, that staff go through when they enter in. I understand you guys have a 40-hour staff training that they go through when they come in. We do as well. One of my things that I want to try to get to is evaluating how effective that is, what that looks like. A lot of the things that we have is kind of online based, and we're not doing as much face-to-face based as we used to. And that's okay. I mean, technology has certainly improved to allow us to be able to work on these things, and there's ways to make that extremely effective. Even when I'm teaching now, most of my courses that I teach now are fully online. So, but there's ways where that technology is getting better between live discussions that you're able to have with people. We're getting better about knowing ways to formulate discussion questions that facilitate better discussion. There's research out there as to, I mean, there's studies out there that look at, for these graduate online courses, different ways to increase the length of feedback that people provide in discussion boards, as well as the depth of that feedback, by simply altering the type of language used in the question. So there's a lot of stuff out there now to start to think about, what we're doing. I should have said that. Is anybody in here a former student of mine? Anybody come through my program? No one wants to raise their hand now. Sometimes I'm curious, because sometimes online I didn't always get to see everybody face to face. So what are some of your thoughts about actually writing down and developing, typing out, thinking about adults learning skills by following this kind of format? Comments, thoughts? Or you can shout.
Hi, I think it's very helpful. I use the very same tool when I provide supervision to my supervisees, and I feel like it helps me become more of a reflective and reflexive practitioner. So just by me developing the form, it makes me think about my own skills, my own shortcomings. What do I need to know before I'm able to then teach it to my supervisors? So I find it extremely helpful.
I agree, and I think that's one of the pieces that's always helped me. Like, I like doing this because I'm always trying to be sure, how do you, as a professional, think about your own professional development and keep yourself up on everything? Now that I've been out of school for so long, that was one of the reasons why I wanted to go back and be an adjunct professor, was so that it put me back into reading my Java articles and having to talk with people about these things, because I started to get too separated from it, and I felt like I wasn't as current. Because when I got done with school, God, I had read, in those 4 years, 1,000+ articles probably. I felt I was as current. I knew everything, current evidence-based practice, when I got out of there, because I'd spent the last 4 years reading all about it. But then you get out of it and you get separated from it, and after so many years you start to wonder, like, God, am I as current as I need to be? What can I do to help that? And so, for me it was going now back to teaching, but I've also found the same thing, that when I'm going through and developing this, when I have to start to think about it some more, and whenever I have to go find, what resources am I going to attach with that, or what's a good article, or I've started finding good, actually links to YouTube videos that I post into these things. There's some great professionally done videos, like on differential reinforcement, that'll take them through a 2-hour lecture of DRAs and DRLs and DROs and DRIs in a nice, good, clear format. And so, I've now linked up YouTube videos into some of the stuff that they watch as an extra resource. But it helped me because I had to go out and find it, and I had to watch it, and so it just helps, I think, develop my skills further as well. What are some other thoughts, comments? Thoughts or questions about any of the other stuff too? Yeah.
I think it's really interesting because we're going through this in our program sort of as we speak, with really trying to write down all of the different tasks that a supervisor might have to do, really trying to outline that. Whereas before it was a lot of just kind of passing the torch. So, you know, I learned from my supervisor who learned from their supervisor, and it wasn't anything that was really written down. It was just kind of these things that everybody seemed to know. And then you get someone who comes in from the outside who doesn't know anything from moving up the ranks, and they're completely lost because it's all just these little idiosyncratic things that people just know. So we've really been trying to kind of separate out everything, write down what the actual task is, make task analyses, determine what different positions are responsible for which job tasks, so that we have a much better thing for, you know, when we get a new staff, we can just say, okay, here are all the things that we need to train you on. Are you good with this? No? Okay, let's go through it then. And I think that's something that we found to be, you know, very helpful as we're continuing to get new people in our program.
And I think when you get to the ones, okay, well, let's go through it then, and that's where you want to be able to say, well, what does let's go through it then look like? And so being able to have something concrete as to what that looks like, I think can be very helpful. Because a lot of our kind of pre-service training that you do with staff and ongoing kind of professional development training, it's going to be through a PowerPoint, it's going to be through activities, it's going to be doing kind of what I'm doing here with you all now. But was that presentation designed in a way that's trying to meet a lot of these types of formats? All right, let's move on. So now we've talked about, you know, you've met with staff, they did a self-assessment, you've identified some goals for them to be able to work on that they're not as strong in. You have a well-designed training curriculum that you're going to use as your format, as their supervisor, to help and support them. You know what they're supposed to be exhibiting, you know how you're going to support them, you know what the mastery criteria is. So now we got to observe. How do we know that they are meeting their requirements now? And there's different types of observations that can occur. Obviously, the most common one that most of us are going to use is going to be direct observation of ourselves in the room, seeing somebody implement a skill. But luckily, in today's technology, there's a lot of other ways to try to do that. People can videotape themselves doing skills and be able to send that to you. There's also live watching of people being able to do that. You know, this is becoming a lot more popular, particularly for people who need BCBA supervision that are in more remote areas and can't do that. So they're having to utilize on some of the different video technologies out there. There's other things there's this thing called behavior capture that I'm going to start looking at. Has anyone ever heard of behavior capture? Anyone yet? So it's video that gets recorded within a room, but there's a way for when an episode is occurring, a crisis, that the teacher can push a button. It sends an automatic text and link to the BCBA. That BCBA, when they click on that, will take them, you can either go straight to live video and start to direct the person in the crisis. And it will have like the last 15 minutes leading up to it, so you have an idea of what was going on. So you can look at that and then step into the situation and try to address it with them. So I was like, well, that's pretty cool. So technology is coming a pretty far way for when you can't have a BCBA be there at all the time, but you have situations where, you know, crises are going to happen and people need some direction. It's not just doing it over the phone, as I have to do sometimes. You know, when I've had teachers have to call me and I've had to try to work them through something that I'm not seeing, or that I really didn't get to see kind of what was leading up to it. Okay. So there's some different tools, and you're going to see that these tools are very familiar tools to a behavior analyst of things that we're used to. We have checklists, rating scales, rubrics, behavioral data. So these are 3 different ways that we're going to talk about that someone could collect data based on the behavior acquisition program that you wrote for those different skills. So checklist and rating scales. Those are pretty straightforward. I mean, we're going to go through, there's pros and cons to a lot of these, and you're going to see, just as you know, with certain behavior that you're going to collect data on, you're going to say, well, this is a good for frequency, this is duration, this is latency, this is going to be an interval recording, this is going to be partial, this is going to be whole, this is going to be momentary time sampling. And a lot of that's going to depend on a lot of different variables that you're going to have to evaluate as a behavior analyst to determine what type of data is going to get you what you actually need to determine that why. So with checklists, they certainly have their uses. They're pretty easy to use. So this is just a basic one where you might be looking at, use of least restrictive intervention, respectful interaction with students, appropriate feedback given to staff. This is one of those more general ones. This is part of the core ones that you might have that you're using. This isn't necessarily that individual goal that you could be working on with somebody, but this gives you an idea, right? You're simply looking at whether that behavior has been observed, not observed, or whether they have established some type of mastery with that. Checklists, rating scales, they're really easy to develop. That's why you'll see a lot of them, right? And I'm sure everyone's utilized something like that in the past that has things down there that you're looking to check off, that people are doing what they need to do. It's pretty easy. It's a good indicator for what should always be observed. So again, these are your core skills that you say are fairly universal, that everyone needs to be doing. Here's the cons. It leaves out that level of performance. So really, you're kind of looking at, did they do it? Did they not do it? But, is there other things to consider? Other variables that you're not able to look at that time, and looking at that level of performance. The other problem is that supervisees will often learn the checklist. So, right, we know that teaching to the test is bad, and giving the person a copy of the test beforehand. Now, I'm not saying you don't, because there shouldn't be any mystery. That comes back to, it shouldn't be a mystery as to what someone is being evaluated on. They should actually have a copy of what that evaluation tool looks like before they're being evaluated. There's nothing wrong with that necessarily, but you can see where, well, if I know that I'm going to be observed and I need to do this, this, and this, guess what? People do this, this, and this. And you kind of wish that they were also doing a little of that and a little of that, but you know what? Yeah, you can't mark anywhere on that because it's not on your form. Because that's not how your system is set up. Maybe you got your notes section, you can write something down there, but I think we all remember it's probably some type of % mastery of so many checks on those items is going to determine, whether a person makes it through probation or gets a 5% raise, or, those types of the things become contingent upon how somebody responds. What, you guys get 10% raises here? What? No. Oh my gosh. I'm at the wrong place. What? No. So what you want to keep in mind is that the checklist, because we're going to be going through lots of different types of ways, can be very useful under certain circumstances, but are more useful when you utilize it in combination of some of the other measures that we're going to talk about. And then obviously including that open-ended comment section, because you always want the availability to be able to include some of those things that maybe just aren't being captured at that moment. Rubrics. How many people are familiar with Charlotte Danielson? Starting to hear a little bit about that. So it's a little different. You'll find it more it started in the gen ed realm. It's made itself over into the special ed realm. It's been adopted that way. It is the new criteria for rating and determining teacher performance in the state of Pennsylvania, and is the primary adopted measure for teacher performance across the majority of this country now. So what she has done is created a rubric that identified core skills that teachers need to exhibit, and then established 4 different ratings from unsatisfactory up to distinguished, and provides very specific descriptions for what each of those ratings can look like. Right? So sometimes you could have a checklist that they're doing it, they're not doing it. You could have a checklist that's kind of like a 1 to 4, and you're giving someone for each skill a 1, a 2, a 3, or a 4. But a rubric is different. That 1, that 2, that 3, that 4, each have very specific measurable criteria, which obviously can increase the likelihood that people will be consistent across rating. Because that's the big thing, is that if teachers are going to be evaluated and that this evaluation is going to determine whether or not they get to keep their job, then they want to be sure that it is designed in a way that multiple people could observe and likely come up with the same type of score. So I know it's going to be a little hard to read, but you can certainly kind of look it up. This is one from Special Ed Scenario. So in 2014, Danielson took the model and adopted it for special education, because as they started to look at it, they're like, oh, well, it was teachers, but special ed is just a little different. And then guess what? When they got into special ed, they figured out special ed is a little different. So when you go to this actual document, it has the core skills that teachers need to exhibit broken down into the rubric with very specific criteria in each one, as you can see, and broken down for each section for what a teacher in a class of kids with autism would look like, intellectual disabilities, multiple disabilities, learning disabilities, and emotional disturbance. It's a big document, okay? Because they've determined that those behaviors are going to look a little different if the base of your population that you're working with is different. So rubrics is another way that we can look at evaluating performance. They obviously take a little bit more time in designing and creating. It's something that I've been doing more so when I teach now, is all of my assignments now get returned back with rubrics, as opposed to, okay, well, you get 9 out of 10 on your discussion board. Okay, well, that's fine, but and sometimes I'll tell someone where they might have could have done better, and then they just have to assume okay, I lost my point in the feedback part where he said I could have added this. So all right, so now I know where I lost my point. But it doesn't give you that more specific feedback of where that was, and you didn't know ahead of time. Maybe I would have included that, Dr. Polis, if you would have had a rubric and kind of letting me know that I could have lost a point if I didn't include that. Right? So rubrics do a good job at really spelling out specifically what you expect from people to do. All right. Let's take our break now before we kind of get into a couple of our other areas of data collection. Give everyone a little stretch, my voice a little rest. So thanks. All right, go ahead. We'll get ourselves started back again. Put that in there. All right. I was looking through your guys' little brochure. I saw a couple of people, but then I think it kind of grew since I had seen something like this last. So you guys got some nice talks. Is this every year? Like multiple people? That's good. And you got Lori coming. So she's excellent. You'll love her, probably better than me. So sadly enough, she's great at what she does. And so is Andy. They're very different presenters, in case you've heard them. But it's actually, it was one of my first jobs when I graduated undergrad, was working for a place called the West Virginia Autism Training Center, and they were contracted with Pyramid. I don't even think he was called Pyramid at that point, that Andy and Lori has, to develop a training overview video, not training, an overview video of the picture exchange communication system. And so in my senior year, my senior project was on PECs. So, and then I worked with this company, and they're like, oh, well, hey, you can come and work with Andy Bonte on this. I was like, oh, okay. So, 22 years old at that point. And I got to work with him and Lori. And so if you actually want to see me 20 years ago with hair and about 30, 40 pounds less, then you can watch that PECS overview video, because I'm in there quite often. So it was a good experience getting to kind of help with writing some of the script and then acting it out, being sure that we were showing all the phases and all the skills appropriately and kind of going back and forth. But it was also very intimidating and overwhelming as a 22-year-old, being responsible for, literally sitting down in a script writing session with Andy and Lori and talking about what this could look like. Well, this is your guys' stuff. What are you asking me for? But it was good, and she's great. So you'll definitely love her. Okay, let's get back to talk about some of our data collection. These are a couple common ones that we're used to, but I threw up a couple things that maybe are different, that aren't as common that we would think about. So these are other skills that you can identify as behaviors to decrease or to increase. So one is OTR. That's a common, opportunities to respond. So one of the skills that we know with kids is obviously the more engaged that a student is with the lesson, the less likely they are to have problem behavior. And we know that in order to engage kids more frequently within lessons, they need to have high rates of opportunities to respond. So one of the things that you can evaluate from staff based on the type of lesson or what they're working on at that point is how well they're doing with creating opportunities to respond. So that's a pretty simple frequency measure. You can establish a baseline criteria for a given lesson, 30 minutes, about how often should there be opportunities for students to actively respond to that lesson. Obviously, it doesn't kind of work when you're talking about tabletop discrete trial. So again, this is about a small group type of instructional lesson format. You can also look at other behaviors that you sometimes need to work on with people. So overused phrases, perhaps. Like, you know what I mean. So one of the skills that takes some time but never anyone really sits down and does with somebody is how to present an FBA in a meeting, in a multidisciplinary meeting. So you have these results. In school, you practiced going out and conducting things, you collect data, you write reports, you turn it in. You're really graded on what you wrote, how you analyzed the data, how you presented it. But in the real world, people want to hear you talk about it because they're not going to read the document necessarily. They should. It's important. We should put all this work in it. But let's face it, they come into the meeting for you then to summarize and give them the main parts out of this piece, because some of the stuff they might not understand. So it's a skill to be able to sit in a multidisciplinary team meeting and present the results of an FBA. And you might find that as you're evaluating somebody who is doing that one of their little habits is to constantly say, and you know what I mean, and you know what I mean. And so there are times where I've worked with staff of helping them kind of get rid of some of those little nervous habits that they might have, things that they might kind of say over and over again, or how they might present themselves. And those are behaviors that I want to work on. In addition to, as you're going to see later, I actually have a real example about feedback that I needed to provide to one of my BCBAs about her presentation of an FBA. So I actually take you through kind of what I said, she said, how I said it that way, why I said it that way, the order in which I structured my conversation. And so you'll also get some time to practice that as well. But you can look at these behaviors through frequency data. You can look at behaviors that you're trying to change through ratio. So we know that sometimes, this is a kind of a general one, that we want to look at the ratio of praise to corrective statements. That's usually one of the biggest indicators that I always look at whenever I've been called into a classroom to say, Dustin, we need you to go over to such and such elementary, you got to go see such and such. And that's actually her name, such and such. So, and you have to go in there and things are a mess. We need you to fix it. That's easy. All right, fix it. And you go over there and you see it's a real mess. Well, one of the first things that I always collect whenever I go into a mess is I'm just sitting back, because I don't know exactly what I'm going to be seeing or coming into or anything, but the one piece of data that I collect always is the frequency of praise statements to corrective statements in that classroom. And I wouldn't say 7 times out of 10. I wouldn't say 9 times out of 10. I would say a zillion times out of a zillion. When I step in, there is more attention being paid to inappropriate behavior than to appropriate behavior. That becomes one of the core pieces, the easiest things that I try to change and start with. Because when you step into a classroom that's just a total mess, there's a lot of things that are going to have to be done. And you're not going to have a lot of time. If you want to start making a quick change in behavior, you're going to have to start with the real easy ones. And one that I typically start with is less attention on the inappropriate, more attention on the appropriate. I'm not saying you can't tell them that what they're doing right now is wrong or that they shouldn't do that. I'm just talking about we need to change the ratio. And so that becomes a big piece of behavioral data that I'm able to collect and see. As that changes, sometimes you don't have to change even a whole lot. You start to change that, you're changing the culture of a classroom, which for me is bigger than anything else of what you're trying to look for. You're not just looking at trying to fix individual student behavior plans, but you need to fix the culture of that classroom. As a behavior analyst, you may not always be there. You have to build the capacity within that classroom to be able to sustain themselves in your absence, without your advice, without your support. And so you want to give them not just the tricks of the trade, because those sometimes can have short effects, but to think about what your long-term interventions and effects are going to be in that classroom. Interval recording data you can use as well. What you can do there is actually take one of those checklists. So if you go back to that checklist that was there, a few slides ago, you can take that and think about if you set that up into maybe a 5-minute. Let's say you set it up to 5-minute partial intervals, so that within this last 5 minutes, was there any opportunity, and if so, did this person exhibit this skill? Boom, plus or minus. Next 5-minute partial interval. Was there an opportunity to exhibit? Yes. Was it there? Plus or minus. And so you can go through some of those. Now, some of the skills on that checklist that I had earlier wouldn't be appropriate for interval recording, but that's what you can actually do. So you can go back, and it's just another way to take that checklist and maybe expand it a little bit more to get some more detailed information. So it's just not, yes, it's there, no, it's not. The next part that we're going to talk about, and one group had an example that they used, was looking at how do you evaluate documentation. All right, so we've talked about some of the individual skills. We're going to later talk about how to evaluate someone's presentation in a meeting. And now we're going to talk about how do you evaluate someone and their use of data. And their collecting of data, writing positive behavior support plans, writing an IEP, writing training protocols. You can use a rubric, checklist, rating scale, specific description for each score. We're going to talk about that. Using expert sources to determine kind of key areas so that, there's a lot of resources out there now that talk about good core elements of positive behavior support plans. There's state guidelines for what is the combination and the necessary and required components of a good annual goal. So those types of things are out there, and you want to make them relevant to what is out there in terms of best practice. Here is a description and a breakdown of core components for an FBA that you could evaluate someone who's maybe doing their BCBA internship with. So starting, description of the student, identifying key variables, age, disability, strengths, weaknesses, and a statement and a purpose of the FBA. Target behaviors are operationally defined with enough detail to ensure accurate data collection from multiple observers. Indirect assessments are identified and introduced accurately. Results are depicted with graphs or charts when appropriate. Results are described in a clear manner, utilizing appropriate behavioral terminology. Interview summaries are accurate and complete. I've actually been working on taking this, because you imagine this can be number 4 if you're developing a rubric. And then if you really want to help people out, you have to show them, well, what would a 3 be for operational definitions? What does that look like? What does a 2 look like for operational definitions? What does a 1 look like? So remember, the checklists just kind of give you what that end top piece, that this is what we expect you to do. But how do you measure someone's growth or performance over time? You're going to need something different than this, perhaps. This is quick and dirty. It's easy. So there's always utility to it, particularly if someone's just getting started. But this can be broken down further into individual ratings and turning it into a rubric. But you can see where, this is good feedback. Someone could have this to use it as a reference as they're designing and developing their FBA, and then they can self-evaluate them, and then you can then come in and evaluate them as well and be able to provide feedback. Has anyone ever evaluated someone's FBA through like a rubric type of system or feedback? So not just, doing it and doing track changes in Word and giving it back to them, but actually helping them see the breakdown of that. So, it's not something that I do for all of mine, because I actually do the first that I said more so, which is doing track changes and giving feedback into the individual sections. But I still try to use this as the format of the feedback that I'm providing to somebody. But I guess more of the BCBAs that I supervise are already really good BCBAs. So for me, it's about fine-tuning their skills and getting them to understand that, which is great, because I can still, the amount of feedback that they get never really changes. And they would think, like, is the feedback going to get less at some point? Well, it doesn't, because there's always that next level. There's always that next piece. And so you find other ways to continue to fine-tune someone's skills. So now, we're getting back to another small group activity here, going back to what we've been working on, continuing to build on that. In a small group, select a data collection method based on some of the ones one of the ones that I had presented to you earlier, and actually create what that might look like. Draft it out and doodle it, not type it up, but create out what that might look like. Because you guys, within your program descriptions that you built, you talked about it, but now that you've heard some of this and you've seen some of the ways to maybe collect data on someone's learning and acquisition of some of these skills, work with your partners to create what that might look like.
So what do we say? Yeah, I mean, I would say that's probably the easiest way.
Right.
Squirming. All right, take another minute and we'll talk about your ideas and some of your data collection. Okay, so now you had a chance to go back, relook at that whole skill protocol that you've been working on and developing. Who wants to share? We'll just take one group this time. Just what type of data you ended up thinking that would be good for you to collect based on the behavior that you're going to monitor. There we go.
All right, so the skill we had chosen was data collection as well, accurate data collection. So we chose to do a rubric, and we, the first step of, we only talked about like the first step of it, which is to be able to observe behavior occurring. So we looked at unsatisfactory, basic, proficient, and distinguished. And under unsatisfactory, we talked about they only observed between 0 and 25% of the behavior that occurred. Mm-hmm. They were looking away, they weren't attending, they had their eyes closed, whatever it might be. And then basic was they observed 25% to 50% of the behaviors that occurred. And they still looked away, but for them, they were attending more frequently. And then proficient was between 50 and 75. And they were focused, but maybe not on the more covert behavior. So they, wouldn't adjust their position or things as more covert behaviors occurred. And then the distinguished would be they were attending the entire time, observed all of the behaviors that had occurred.
Excellent. Great. So that just gives you another idea. There's lots of different ways those rubrics can become very helpful. I think they're also helpful to develop themselves. I've found that in the graduate courses that I teach in developing rubrics for the assignments also helps center me as to what am I really looking for them from this assignment? What really are my expectations? And how do I weight those expectations? Because sometimes I'll have the rubric and certain things you can earn different points for, but the point value is different. So for this item, you can have the 4 different levels, but you can get 10 points, 8 points, 4 points, and 0 points. And for this item, you can get 15 points, 12 points, 8 points, 0 points. So, and I weight out some of those things, but it's still utilizing a rubric, but giving people an idea of, certain parts are going to be more important than others, so I put more weight on that. But by giving the rubric, it makes it a little easier for them to know what's expected of them. And that's going to be what's really important, particularly when we start talking about providing feedback. And what are some of the ways to ease those fears that people have about providing and or receiving feedback? Building the culture is very important. Building that relationship with staff so that when you are coming to work with them and you're doing this under the guise of their supervisor, that there shouldn't be any surprises. This should be just part of what we do. And it should be designed in a supportive process, not a gotcha process, not a let's find a way to paper them out process. When people feel that that's the intention behind supervision, they're going to have a bad taste in their mouth about it. They're going to view you in a different light. You need to find ways to be able to establish yourself as a supporter of their behavior, as the person who is going to help them reach and get to that next level of their own professional development. And you have to keep creating some of those different levels, and if not, people can get very, very stagnant. So I'm big on trying to find other ways, and even at the IU, we're trying to find other ways, and we've gotten a little stuck at the PCA level, where what do we do next? How do you get that person to that next level? Because not everyone wants to go and get a master's degree and go above and beyond and do something like that. But what do you do with them next? So one of the things that we're starting to evaluate is the RBT model and trying to create an additional level of training and certification for them to be registered behavior technicians recognized through the BACB. So part of that is one, building the skill sets of others. Another part of what I try to do as a supervisor now is focus on staff retention. How do I keep people? Well, you keep people by building good cultures. That's first and foremost. And if you look at any survey on staff satisfaction, the one thing that most people think is what people want to be able to be happy with their job is not what people actually end up rating, and that's money. And we talk a lot about money, but money, over any study you'll see, doesn't define happiness within your job. There's a lot of other things that are more important than the money. And so obviously in this field we know there's not a lot of money. And the job is very difficult. So how do you build those other components? How do you build that culture? Well, you build it through an idea that you are there to support them. And that supervision time and that feedback time that you have to provide for someone should be viewed as something they're looking forward to. That this is the time to celebrate your growth in what you're doing. You want to be sure that the supervisee is well aware of that process. That eases it. Remember, we talked before about having that pre-meeting, letting them know what this looks like, what you're going to be looking for, when you're coming in. These are all things to make it a little bit easier. You can always have unannounced visits, but I don't think the first visit that you do on somebody, an observation, should be an unannounced one. I just don't think that way. So here are 6 components to providing feedback that we'll go through an actual example that I'll talk about in the next couple slides. The first one is, this is like thinking of that format, like you've actually now just sat down in your chair, they've sat down in theirs, and you're getting ready to have that feedback. And I will tell you that typically I don't like to have feedback across people, like on tables. Like if I do have feedback with somebody, if I'm doing it, it's going to be both of us kind of sitting here. You know, table serves as a psychological barrier between this is my side, this is your side. I am this way, you're this way. So even those pieces do actually make a difference. So feedback should reference the collected data. So the first thing that, you know, when you go to kind of start to talk about things, you're going to come back to, now let's talk about some of the things that I was able to see the other day. I know this is the form that I shared with you that we're going to be using. And so now we can actually go through and talk about some of these different pieces and things that we can continue to do to help you with and things that you're doing a spectacular job with. The corrective feedback as you provide it should be solution-oriented. So there's a way to phrase and say something where it's just not like, I don't understand, I've already asked you to do this, and I saw that you're still not doing it. Right? Think about behavior support plans. When we talk about providing redirective feedback to students, what's the one thing that we always be sure that we include in there, that we want to be sure staff do? Avoid the words kind of like no, don't, and stop. Because why? Because that only tells them what not to do. We want people to state directions in the positive way. Tell the kid what you want him to doing. Not stop running, it's we need to walk. Right? So we do that in our behavior plans. So we want to do that when we're sitting down and giving feedback to somebody. Telling them what they're doing wrong doesn't tell them what they should be doing. So it's just a different way. Just like when we formulate that discussion that we have with staff about changing that language just a little bit. So we're not saying, you know, no, don't, and stop as much. We're still wanting to acknowledge and change the behavior with verbal feedback, but it's just twisting it a little bit. Same thing here. Going to twist it a little bit. People are going to be a lot more receptive. The supervisee then receives feedback on what he or she is doing well. So then you go over, obviously, strengths as well. You don't want to leave out the things that they're doing well. The professional goals are used to explain why this skill is being discussed. So you always want to be able to bring it back. Remember, and that's a goal that was developed and identified with the person. So when you're bringing this back, you're bringing back something that they identified through their own self-assessment. So this isn't that intimidating. This isn't that surprising. This is actually something that they agree upon, that they're looking for that support to be able to continue to address and work on. And then the opportunities for the supervisee then to respond to that feedback. So you always want to be sure that you have a chance in which to say something back to someone and be able to engage in that dialogue. Remember in that first slide toward the beginning of the evening, we talked about this is not a one-way, this is not an authoritarian type of supervision style. This is more democratic in that we are engaging in a conversation back and forth regarding your skills and how we can continue to support and develop them. And then you want to determine follow-up. So whenever you get done with something, there should be, what does that follow-up look like? So that you can still maintain that monitoring and that you can still maintain that support. That's a big part of that we know with staff development training, that to be honest, like a lot of training that's just purely lecture-based. I mean, there's so much research out there in terms of, you know, it used to be it's like 20 minutes. Attention spans aren't even 20 minutes. And so like there's very little information that you can kind of hope to get people to understand through just this type of format when you do that. That's one of the reasons why I try to incorporate some of these activities, and we're going to finish with a kind of a fun activity as well, because you have to practice it. Now, hopefully you've seen as I go through this, you know, I get frustrated sometimes when people speak, and it's like they're speaking about how to be really good instructors and how to prompt well and design reinforcement systems and behavior plans, but they're not thinking at all about how to teach, how do you apply that same skill in your presentation? Like, you know, so I want people to have some kind of permanent products that you've got some ideas that you've thought about and that you've kind of developed as you've gone through here. So it's the same thing that you want to think about with your own staff development training that you're doing with people, that it's a very hands-on process. It's a feedback-driven process. It's an inquiry-driven process. So on the left-hand side are the steps that you just saw on the previous slide. And then this is an example of a conversation that I've had. So Kelly, you did a good job facilitating the review of Johnny's FBA. You spoke very clearly to the parents, and they appeared very comfortable with what you had to share with them. So again, starting with just that positive aspect of what you saw. Now, describe the ineffective performance related to goals. And looking over some of the skills we discussed on your annual goals, there are a couple things we can continue to work on together. See, we. It's another big word that I use a lot, and I think you've heard me use when I've talked about a lot of things today. It's always about support. It's about help. It's about we. I don't say a lot of I and you. Okay? So, there were times when the data needed to be explained in greater detail and in more layman's terms. So now you provide the rationale for that. So why, okay, but why is that important? Well, this will ensure that the other team members and the parents gain a better understanding of the meaning of the data. Then when you're talking about interventions, it's going to make more sense to them. Okay, right? Because again, it's not saying that, you know, it makes sense when you provide that rationale for that, then it starts to make more sense and they become more receptive then to that feedback. And then you have to provide an example. Okay, well then what will that look like? It's rationale, I'm buying it, I get that. But now you've told me I'm not supposed to do this, but now it's about well, what do I need to do? For example, when you said the 5-minute partial interval data indicated that aggression occurred during an average of 32% of recorded intervals across multiple settings, you could have then added, so basically in a regular 45-minute instructional block, we'll see Johnny engage in 3 episodes of aggression. Okay? I think sometimes behavior analysts get too caught up in writing FBAs and behavior plans that can be too technical, particularly the FBAs. And I think one of the faults, and I'm certainly at fault for that, is when we are taking people through graduate programs, we are wanting you to write like a behavior analyst because it's our way of assessing your skills as to whether you're really getting it. Can you use the vocabulary? Because obviously taking that test, it's like a vocabulary test for the most part. So you learned this whole new language. Can you use it when you write? Well, that's when you're in the college, that's when you're in the graduate class. You should be writing that way. Problem is that when you get done with that, unless someone's told you any differently, you start writing FBAs, you know, that just goes over people's heads. How useful is that, right? This is applied behavior analysis. This is a socially driven, right? Everything that we do has to have a social connection. And if you can't connect to the people that you're trying to present this information with, then your FBA is kind of useless. So I think it's important that we start to not dummy down the science by any means, but there are ways to explain something where you aren't sounding, because people just we get a bad rap, and people will just think like, well, they're using all those terms, like, well, he's a BCBA, and that's just, you know, these are these BCBAs, this is what they write. It doesn't make any sense to me. That's the last thing I ever want anyone to think about when they're reading one of my FBAs. Can I write it using language that will literally make their head spin? Absolutely. Is that going to help me? Is it going to make me look smarter and I'm going to feel better in their eyes like I'm the expert? No, it's not. In the end, it has to be about the kid. How do we help this team help the kid? And so you have to think about your FBAs. And you almost have to kind of unlearn some of the behaviors that you were doing in grad school when preparing to be a behavior analyst, where people like myself made you write like you're writing an article for Java. But that's not how you want to write in real life. Soapbox, sorry about that, but I'll get back to this. But okay, so provide an opportunity for the supervisee then to respond. So you can ask a nice open-ended question at that point, a couple of them. What are your thoughts on this additional information to your data discussion? Do you think that this could work? Would this have made sense in that area? What are some of your ideas? What additional help can you think of that I might be able to do with you in that area? So these are all open-ended. These are all focused, supportive questions that we're trying to do. And then the follow-up. You have another meeting next week to present Sarah's FBA. Why don't we meet before then and we can go over some of the ways to talk about her data, particularly with that team. So it kind of says it like, oh, okay, thanks, and I throw in that, particularly with that team. It's really about trying to get that person back to be able to do that. But again, you just try to lessen that it's, people hate to, I know, feel like they've done something wrong. And that's why if you can set up feedback sessions in a certain way that are more supportive, then that's great. They're not always going to work out that way. I mean, there's sessions that I've had to end because it's not productive. And there are times where you'll have people who just yes you to death and then leave the room and go do something exactly different. Sure, Dr. Polis, I got it. Not a problem, thank you. Yep. I'm like, you're deliberately trying to be a smartass, aren't you? Because I know exactly when you say that you're just trying to appease me and you're going to go out there and do the same thing again. And so, that becomes my problem. I have to start to think about the why, right? So now I've got to think about, so then why are you doing that? Like, we've given this feedback. I've tried to be supportive and constructive with it. It's based on you and me engaging in this discussion. And then there gets to be the point where it doesn't work and I have to put my behavior analyst hat on again, which is what we do, which is find out the whys. So you have to then go back into that. Now, what you're going to do here is practice giving and receiving feedback to a partner. Now, the sheet that I had, it got cut up, but I needed to have one person has to have one scenario, and then another person's going to have a different one, because you can't read what the other person. So you have two scenarios: scenario 1 and scenario 2. One is a supervisor, one is a supervisee. So give one to one person, one to the other, because you can't have. You don't have to split that sheet, not that sheet. The sheet's already been split. That's why you have those. So like, let's say here, you have scenario 1 supervisee. Do you have scenario 1 supervisor? You do. So those are good. So just be sure that the first top one of one person says scenario 1 supervisee and the other one says scenario 1 supervisor. All right? Because it's got one time you're going to be the supervisee the first time, and in being the supervisee, they have a curveball. All right, so that's why I don't want the other person reading the curveball. And so you're the supervisor, you have your question, but she's also got a curveball that she's going to throw you while you're giving feedback. Then it's going to switch. You're the supervisor, you're the supervisee. You have a curveball in your feedback that you're going to give her while she's trying to cover what she has to cover. Okay? So pair up, practice, think about the different sections that we talked about, and see how it is about giving and receiving this feedback. And remember, you don't have to read things verbatim. You just kind of look it over, get a feel for the topic, and then just start talking. It's about talking.
Now I'll get my names mixed up. When you were working with staff and providing for that, I noticed that you specifically for how she did a great job at using the appropriate redirection technique when John started raising his voice, but that if his parents would trial some medication, it may help reduce the frequency of his call-outs. So I wanted to talk more about and see what we could do to make sure that way. Yes, but we don't want parents. I know, right? No pressure.
More pressure, right? The supervisor watching the supervisor.
Well, I thought it would be okay because I heard you talking about these kids
So I went with perfect.
I was so not looking
So you're going to be getting some more feedback on some other professionals next week. What do you think we could do that's specific? Or like an agenda of what we could discuss with them, that we can stick to like the agenda. So like you do a good job shutting it down. Good. So I noticed that you were your job. Yeah. And I can see that.
Okay. So, am I going to be able to get a copy of that video?
You want a copy?
Yeah, a copy of it? That would be great.
Yeah, I can't do it today.
Oh, no,
But
today.
yeah, when the marketing team gets it, I'll have them breaking out another copy for you.
Oh,
How's
awesome.
that?
Thanks, good.
So I just don't understand. I mean, he brushed his teeth for the first time. Look at the data. We did it.
Yeah, it's really helpful. I was just saying, I was talking with a supervisee, and I was told in meetings I can be a bit intimidating, but as a supervisor, I received that feedback. So it was helpful because I had to think about like, how I was actually presenting myself in that conversation. So I was saying that I thought that was really helpful that they were able to provide me with that feedback
Okay.
too. So.
All right, so here's some, whoops, before I,
Let's not.
all right, take another minute and we will talk about this activity. See what great supervisors you are. All right. So, how comfortable did everyone feel doing that? That nice and comfortable? You feel like you were able to give that feedback, receive that feedback, get a little practice? Do you like your little curveballs there and see how you responded? So, who wants to make just a comment about what that experience was of trying to sit down and actually practice that particular skill in this little pseudo?
I was just going to say, I like role plays a lot. I've done them in classes and behavioral supervision series and different things. I liked how this one was set up, that we each had a different thing that we read. So as soon as I started talking, I still wasn't getting that we had different scenarios until she started interrupting. I was like, no, I just said a trial. Blah, blah, blah. And so I thought that was a really effective way of, I was like, why are you being so snarky? And she's like, it's what it's telling me to do. But I've never set up a role play like this myself in training, so I thought that was really nice the way that was set up, and I think we'll do some things differently in some of our activities.
Great. Hey, job well done. I'm good. That's right. Who else has a comment on this activity and what they thought about it?
I think we did this in practice yesterday, Dr. Woods, and then just doing it today was pretty much like helpful, but like giving my supervisor, my long-term supervisor feedback was kind of a little weird, but so,
Kind of good to be in that role though, right? It was kind of good to switch that up a little.
I thought one of the things that my partner was able to do that was really good was in each scenario, I think the person's heart was in the right place and they were trying to make a decision ultimately for the best care of the client. And she was able to notice that and validate that while still providing me constructive feedback.
So she handled the curveballs well?
Yes.
You would give her in the rubric out of 10 a what?
10 out of 10.
A 10 out of 10, okay.
I think it's important to have ethical questions when you're role playing, because even though when you're giving feedback, you give the opportunity for people to kind of give their perspective of how they would do it differently. But for people who don't understand the ethical code, there is no doing it differently. Like, you have to follow the code, and there are things you can do and things you cannot do. So I think in those situations, it's a little harder. Not like necessarily harder, but it's just, there isn't really a gray area because it's ethics. So, and you have to allow them to speak, but it's a little bit more concrete with, you actually can't do that. So
Right, and I think it's very important. I mean, the ethics obviously is critical, and there's parts of ethics that are in there, and there's lots of things that you can put scenario wise and have people practice with giving feedback there. And certainly, if I'm ever invited back, I actually have a ethics training that I do. So I designed it a couple years ago to then give for, once I knew everyone was going to need those 3 hours every year. So I thought I put together something similar to this, where you have to end up doing the same thing, where you actually have a similar role play where you're working through some ethical dilemmas, is what it's called. So you have these ethical dilemma activities that you have to engage in that I think is really important. And so that's something that, I'd always be more than happy to also give to you guys at some point, and then everyone kicks out those 3 hours of ethics they have to get for that research. So great. I'm glad you guys kind of enjoyed that activity. It's definitely nice to be able to have kind of that feedback from me, because I'm always kind of looking for that, and I'm sure there's going to be feedback that you guys have to fill out as well, and I'm always open to feedback and looking at this. This was a training that I did before, but it was only, I think, an hour and a half, so I had to expand upon it, add some more slides, add a soapbox or two. So wrapping things up. Back into, segue, ethical guidelines. So I used to have this at the beginning of the presentation, so now I just kind of moved to the end because, people just really don't like talking about ethics, although ethics can be really fun to do when you're doing it in a group, but it's just not as fun to kind of teach, because much like you said, it is what it is. There's not a lot of gray area. It's supposed to be this way. So it's not as fun to teach. You can't be somewhat as creative, but I think I've found some ways. But it's important to understand we have ethical guidelines as behavior analysts. You can download them here that are our ethical guidelines now as supervisors? Now that in order to supervise someone, you have to take this course, well, you're also agreeing to abide by certain ethical standards regarding supervision. And so I'm just putting this up as kind of a wrap-up reference to know that your supervisory competence, meaning that just like we are with our practicing competence, we have an ethical obligation to only practice within what we are knowledgeable, skilled, trained, and able to provide. Okay? I'm not fluent and excellent in organizational behavior management, so that I wouldn't be a great person to say, oh yeah, I can come out to your company, pay me, and I'll come out and do that. I'm a behavior analyst, so I can do organizational behavior management. It's not a problem. But it's not within my realm of skills and expertise, so I shouldn't be practicing that way. You shouldn't be supervising people that also, and providing feedback to people that are working in areas that are outside your realm of professional competency. So I think we have to continue to remember that. Your supervisory volume, being sure that's why those guidelines, oh my gosh, between the group supervision and then the individual supervision and 5% for this and 4% for that and 2.782% for that. So, they've come up with a lot of very specific things that they're looking for in terms of what the supervision can look like, how often you can do group, how often you have to do individual. So you want to remember that even outside of the BCBA guidelines, just think about it as good practice for your own professional guidelines, that you have enough time. Because this doesn't work if you don't have the time. And I know that's the biggest thing that they've never figured out a way to create more of. And that is time. Because to take someone through and support them in the manner that I'm talking about means that your ratio of supervisor to supervisees have to be amenable to be able to implement this type of level of service. And so, that's not always going to be possible everywhere you go, given different financial constraints, obviously. I still say you try your best, you take what you can, you try to find the core components of some of the things that I've talked about today and see what you can do about getting them implemented. So, in summary, don't forget the qualities. We talked earlier, and that's why I set the stage in the beginning, coming back in the end with the same message. You guys did an excellent job at the beginning talking about the qualities of a good staff. And now I say, go back and take a look at what your evaluation systems look like and see if those core qualities are contained within those systems or whether they're more about prompting, error correction, reinforcement, data collection. There are some other really important parts. Not that those other parts aren't important. You got to do those too. Come back to those qualities. Have some discussions about what does that kind of look like, and do we need to rethink of how we're doing that? Because the more that you start to make some of your discussions with staff about qualities, then you're bringing that human nature back in, and it's feeling more like a supportive environment than a rat environment where you're just learning up to a certain point and it's just. So feedback is not quarterly, semi-annual, or an annual process. You should think of feedback as an everyday process. It's the same way that I approach being a behavior analyst, coming into a classroom. People have asked me, they're like, Dustin, so when you do an FBA, and I said, whoa, what do you mean when I do an FBA? I'm like, well, when you go out and you conduct an FBA. It's like, I'm always conducting FBAs. It's what I'm always doing. My mind is there. Now, am I producing always a permanent product in some way? No. But my mind, of every time that I'm in a room, it's about doing an FBA. My mind doesn't turn off like that. Everything that I look at and that I see and that I'm observing from both student behavior and staff behavior, I'm looking at it through that mindset. Thinking of the whys. Why the kid is doing that, why the staff is not doing that. And so it's always there. So it's not like it just turns itself off. The same thing when you think about the supervision and the feedback. It should never turn off. It shouldn't just be at these set designated times. Obviously, those kind of do have to occur. There's HR reasons, there's different types of things and regulations. Those are fine. But understand that that process shouldn't be just defined by those due dates and deadlines, and that you want to make it part of what you do as a supervisor. So take that same philosophy that you use to design and evaluate programming for students and apply to supervisees. That was my other main points I wanted to be sure I brought back at the end, was that we know how to assess that why. There are different ways that we do that where we're thinking about that. We want to do the same things with staff and apply that same supportive, positive behavior support process and methodology to changing the behavior of the staff that you work with. Here are just a few references that you can look at, and that kind of, yep, that would be summing it up. So thank you guys very much this evening. You guys were great. I hope you found some pieces that you can take back and better the work that you do, because I know Melmark does amazing work, and I think you guys should be very proud of what you do every day. Thank you.